Hello, I am Enrique Escabok. So Diana D. Enrique Derange. I am Standing Bear Grandmother's Keeper, and Enrique Escabok is my new, is a name that I have now since I got married. Enrique means woman who rules, and Escabok means like a new budding leaf. So Enrica who rules with the new budding leaf. And I am a missing and murdered Indigenous woman survivor. And I am advocating for the repudiation of the doctrine of discovery, the terra nullius, and inter cetera, which were very racist policies that was part of the papal bulla, which was in the doctrine of discovery, and these things that the papal bull used to justify slavery of Africa and Africans, and for the conquest and to dispossess indigenous peoples all over the world of their lands. And this terra etc. was by Pope Alexander VI in 1783, I believe. No, sorry. In 1493. Sorry, in 1493. That was inter cetera, which is part of the doctrine of discovery, and making it okay for Christians, those of the Catholic Church, to dispossess indigenous peoples of their lands because they're not Christians. So that doesn't make them humans, and the only rights indigenous people have was to occupy the land, much like an animal. And these racist policies and these racist doctrines is the foundation of Canada as a nation, because in 1583, Queen Elizabeth, maybe before 1583, Queen Elizabeth was excommunicated from the Roman Catholic Church, and thus began the Anglican Church, but Queen Elizabeth adopted the doctrine of discovery so that the British could build its empire in conquest and conquering new lands to grow their empire and influence throughout the world in trade and commerce, to build the British Empire. So when Canada is formed, and they came to Canada and to claim lands and to come and conquer lands in the Americas and Canada, and the French in Canada. So the French and the British both exercised, because the French were Roman Catholic mostly, and they exercised the doctrine of discovery along with the Anglican Church. And the head of the Anglican Church, just so you know, is the Crown. In England, British, whatever, the United Kingdom, this is the Crown that is the head of the Anglican Church, and allowed for residential schools, and allowed for the lands to be and allowed for the dispossession of indigenous people, and for the lands to be exploited, and for infrastructure to be built, and to move indigenous peoples and dispossess them And the agreements that were made and the treaties that were made allowed them to not have to honor these agreements and not have to fulfill their obligations, because the doctrine of discovery gave them all the rights. And the native peoples, the only right that native peoples had in this doctrine is to occupy the land, much like animals. They had no right. And then there was a creation of the Indian Act to control and move native peoples. The Indian Act was created to control, and also the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which are the enforcers, the ones who were there to protect the Crown's interests, forcibly remove children from their homes and people from their lands and put them onto small little plots of land, and so to make way for new settlers, and so that they can colonize, extract resources, and build the infrastructure and build this nation. And in that, there is also, because of the ingredients, there is a trust fund that is there, where there is trillions of dollars in this trust fund from the years of this nation being formed, and that, the wealth and the extraction and the agreements and all that kind of stuff, and that the monies or whatever would be put into trusts. And it's an amalgamation of a few funds, of a few trusts, and put into this Indigenous Trust Fund in Canada. And this is what the Canadian government has been wrongfully taking money to fund the Indian Act and to fund their efforts. So this is the atrocity. This is the conspiracy. It's time for the repudiation of the doctrine of discovery, terra nullius, inter cetera, and and the many other papal bulls that were adopted, and ideas that were adopted to conquer and dispossess Indigenous peoples of their lands, and for slavery. Now, slavery has been abolished for the most part, by royal decree, and there's been policies against slavery and the United Nations. And recently, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People is there in the UN now, but it's just a platitude. It's really, there's no power to enforce it. Nations don't have to agree to it, although Canada did sign on to honor the in 2014, when this United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, this was passed in 2007. But in 2014, Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada, signed on to acknowledging the rights of Indigenous people, the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, to implement it into Canadian law, Constitution, and the Canadian Charter and the Bill of Rights hasn't really been amended since 1981. And in 1981, when the Queen came and signed a new Charter of Rights, Indigenous peoples and Black peoples were not considered, or their rights or anything hasn't been adjusted or recognized or acknowledged. There's been no real change in the Canadian Charter of Rights in terms of its Indigenous peoples here in Canada. And Indigenous peoples allowed for this nation to be formed at our expense, at our cost, at the cost of my ancestors and all of those aunties and uncles and grandmothers and grandfathers that were never to be, because they didn't get to live. They were killed and murdered as children in residential schools, and many of ancestors killed and moved and died because of the forming of this nation, so this nation can be founded. Native peoples pushed aside for non-indigenous peoples to come here and settle and build and create wealth without at the expense of indigenous peoples, and without our consultation, without our permission, without our inclusion in the leadership and the governing of this nation. So now I feel that it's time to repudiate this doctrine of discovery, and it's time to create a new nation with indigenous and non-indigenous leadership, uniting and coming together to create a new constitution, to create a new nation with indigenous peoples there in decision and policy making, and in the creation of the new constitution, a new charter of rights. We don't want to kick people out of our nation. We just want to be acknowledged, and be acknowledged for the rightful landowners and landlords. We can be free from the crown. It's time to it is time for the crown, because it has unjustly and with misrepresentation. The vitiates to repudiate the doctrine of discovery are undue duress, coercion, misrepresentation, deception, undue hardship, and the exploitation of indigenous peoples, the many sexual crimes and violent crimes considered done towards indigenous peoples, the starvation of indigenous peoples, the unjust and unethical and inhumane practices, the starvation policies that were passed by John A. Macdonald, wanting to starve the people, and other leaderships and other past leaderships that have enacted policies in order to eradicate and deal with the Indian problem. So if we want to heal and no longer have a nation built on shame and blame, well, it's time to do away with that old monarchy, with that old way of thinking and doing things, and come together and create a new constitution, amalgamating all the chiefs and leaderships in Canada to come together and consolidate and make a new agreement honoring the rights of Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and bringing those peoples to the table, to government, to leadership, honoring our elder councils, honoring our youth, honoring our women and matriarchs, and our warriors and men, so that we can go forward and have a new just nation. Chimigwech. And I am a missing and murdered Indigenous woman survivor. An Indian day school survivor. My ancestors survived residential school. My mother was in residential school. My grandmother in residential school. My father was abused by the priests in the Indian day schools and in the schools. And my husband. So, if we really want to go forward and move forward and heal, well, let's birth a new nation and heal and work together.